E nā iwi, e nā reo, e rau rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and welcome to you all, and a special welcome to our guest speakers, Heidi and Carwyn and Danielle. So we're going to do a little tag team for the first little bit. Susan, who's going to introduce the theme, and then over to Jan, who will introduce the speakers. So over to Susan.
Good evening and welcome. It's lovely to see you here on a Friday night. It's a good thing to do on a Friday night, to flourish as a human being, so hope you enjoy the evening. I'm Susan Jones, I'm the minister here at St Andrews. It says here I'm going to introduce the evening and reprise the lectures in the Human Flourishing series. You can relax, I'm not going to reprise them in great detail. But just to say that I found this topic interesting when it came up at the Study Trust Board. And I started thinking about to what degree I thought Christianity, which is what this church is about, the church that started the Study Trust, what it had to do with human flourishing. And I think a lot of people think it's all about God, Christianity. And But when I thought about it, I thought it's very significantly about human beings, and particularly how we interact with the sacred and how our spirituality is expressed. And Christianity wouldn't be anything without the human part of our title, Human Flourishing. And then, believe it or not, Christianity, and especially St Andrews, is about the flourishing bit too. It's about basically doing well. The hope that humanity does well, that it's creative, that we exercise compassion, that we're looking after the planet and each other, that we are loving and being loved. We're connecting, we're interacting, dancing, laughing, crying, doing it all well, whether we're grieving or we're celebrating. And so it's a delight to be here introducing a seminar that has disparate and various approaches to human flourishing and a wide range of speakers. I remember being thrilled at the second lecture that was in the lead up to the series, when Generation Y young people were telling us about how they saw the world and what they were doing to make sure that people flourished in the world. Again, a wide variety of approaches and a wide variety of passion being brought to bear on the subject. So we who are going to be listening to speakers, we will be flourishing. But also we've planned that the weekend will have times when we can sing and we can talk to each other, we can discuss and reflect as well, so that we're not just expecting experts to tell us how to flourish or how they're flourishing, but we can actually engage with the material ourselves and think that through for ourselves so that it becomes part of us. My thoughts often turn to poetry at these moments. And I thought of Mary Oliver's poem, The Wild Geese, which some of you will know well. It seems to me to fit. You do not have to be good. Yes. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Enjoy and flourish.
Thank you. So it's my role and my pleasure this evening to introduce the speakers. And the first speaker for this evening is Heidi Thomson. Heidi is an associate professor in the School of English, Film, Theatre and Media Studies, and she's a passionate advocate of the value of humanities and arts in today's society. And there's more about her in the notes that you've got. And so rather than telling you about that, I'd just like to introduce her. So she's got lots of time to talk to you about her passion and its importance to human flourishing. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for having me. My expertise is bafflement, actually, and that is why I'm here. I've become increasingly baffled about the role of something I had been taking for granted for 35 years as a professional. So last year I was chatting with Jan Rivers in her kitchen about the increased apparent need for a justification of humanities in society, in the university, in our schools. And as these things go, I was waxing lyrical about attention spans and science taxonomies for humanities grounds and quantification over qualification. And Jan just stopped me and she said, maybe I should come and talk about this topic here. And so that is why I am here. And I want to say right away, I have absolutely no ready solutions. Actually, I think the pressure to come up with ready solution is part of the problem, probably. So I have been teaching and studying humanities largely in its manifestation in English literature for 35 years. And I can't even, of course, scratch the surface in about 15 to 20 minutes. But what I valued in particular about my education and how I grew up was the opportunity to think and to read about a field, and I had the luxury to take that for granted for my entire lifespan so far. And one thing is for sure, that luxury is gone, because it was part of a vision that was grounded in, and more importantly, subsidized by tax-funded egalitarian welfare state, and in my case, that was Belgium. And many of you are probably aware of a book called The Spirit Level. Actually, there are two books with that title that I know of, and Susan may know the other one because she loves poetry, and one is a fantastic collection by Seamus Heaney. 1996 poetry collection, which I warmly recommend. The other one is the book I thought about for this talk today. Its full title is The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. Published Penguin 2009 by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. So the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the worse everyone is off in terms of quality of life. So equitable societies fund many things that are not purely individually profit-driven. Things like good healthcare, education, retirement homes, cultural initiatives, libraries. So all of that happens through a kind of a shared vision that goes beyond individual profit. And in order to prepare for this talk, I read that book a couple of years ago, but I also read two books by two very smart women. One by Martha Nussbaum, who is a philosophy and law professor, and she wrote a book called Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And the other book I read was Helen Small's book, The Value of the Humanities. And Helen Small is an alumna of Victoria University, and she's now a professor at Oxford and writes about a wide range of topics, including the humanities. So my own grounding, just sort of speaking from where is this coming from, my own grounding in the humanities is rooted in Belgium, where I grew up and I got my first university degrees. And I'm definitely not saying that education system was perfect, far from it. it's contrary to what some people may think, actually. It was remarkably channeled. It focused largely on rote learning. The system was very authoritarian. It reveled in antiquated hierarchies. It was completely misogynist. But it was almost free, in the sense that largely accessible for all. And it also assumed that you could change your mind about a field of study if something didn't work out. It also assumed that any emphasis on quantity in research was irrelevant. And admittedly, while there wasn't necessarily much quality research either, there was something which is a little bit different. There was a decent amount of scholarship. And scholarship, I mean, this could be not a topic really, talking about the differences between scholarship and research. So informed knowledge about a subject which my professors taught, as opposed to the kind of soundbite research we are now supposed to churn out around the PBRF clocks. And I know that some of you here had or have affiliations with Victoria. Well, when I started at Victoria in 1990, one of my loveliest colleagues was a man called Harry Oarsman. Have you heard of him? You know, he would be a complete zero in complete PBRF terms at the moment, because one dictionary, hello, what else have you done? That's your first NRO. Where are the 3 other ones? Okay, so this really is a very different environment now. So the whole system that I grew up in, with its rather dismissive, laissez-faire attitude to pedagogy, I mean, students were sort of, also assumed actually, at some level, by default perhaps, that I could figure out what to do with my own time. So I did not have to meet bite-sized assignment standards, which are delineated and justified in increasingly smaller bites, thereby losing track of the overall picture. Instead, I had an opportunity, a funded opportunity, to relish reading widely, intuitively, in several languages. I never asked my professors if there was an abridged version of Crime and Punishment. I wouldn't have dared to. Neither did I ask if there was a movie, but I also didn't feel the urge. In a way, slow reading, like slow cooking, was part of life and of the humanities. And I'm not sort of waxing nostalgic about the good old days here. This is not the kind of, a vision of a distant land that was oh so much better. It was not, in many other ways was not, because when I was born, the Second World War had only been over for about 15 years, and I grew up entirely in a household where food, was still a big deal, So it was not, a charm, so to speak. So far from perfect, and at that stage, rather arrogantly confident about its permanent status of importance, a humanities education in Belgium offered something that was not entirely about assessment, quantifiable research, or, thirdly, vocational application, strictly vocational application. So fast forward from 1980s Belgium to 2017 Wellington, via 6 years in the United States, where accountability of the humanities was already an entirely different matter than in Belgium. The idea of justifying what you're doing, or the cost of what you're doing, was already well established in the States by then. And I remember struggling with the report I had to write for Fulbright, which partly funded my studies. How was reading and writing about romantic poetry going to be useful? And you came up with an answer, I was going to be a teacher, and all this reading and writing would be passed on, it would be great. And it was keen, enthusiastic, and that's great, but it was also quite inarticulate. And it's a kind of inarticulate kind of fervor that is no longer enough. And I've become very aware of that. So there's no doubt in 2017 in Wellington and beyond that the fate of the humanities has changed drastically. So what I did was kind of think about some of the issues, and that's all I really want to throw out. I would love to work more on this, like tomorrow or in another context as well. But I'll just sort of trash out what I came up with. So you can see there's a sort of neat CV there, and engagement which all involved teaching. I got diplomas in secondary teaching, and when there were no jobs in secondary teaching, I got involved with adult literacy volunteering. So you became an instant social worker, kind of basically women's refuge person, teacher, childminder, all rolled into one. So it was very kind of educational experience until I went to the States, and there again I did teaching of writing courses, literature courses, and then I became a lecturer here. So, in terms of employment, when people now say, what do you teach? I say, I teach literacy. Because I want to teach thinking critically, thinking imaginatively, creatively, being able to write about things, being able to express what matters. And when I looked up humanities in the OED, and I should have written that down, but it came from the OED, source acknowledgement. What's very crucial about the definition of the humanities as we find it in a dictionary is that it has, as distinguished from the social sciences, a significant historical element usually. It talks about interpretation rather than the experimental and the quantitative. So I thought about that definition, and I thought some more about those 3 books that I had been reading, and I realized that a dictionary definition gives you an illusion of timelessness. This is not going to change, this is permanent, this is what the humanities are. Yet, the reality in which we operate has changed so drastically, has changed so enormously, at a range of levels, at the level of society, our political climate, economics, technology, communication, education. Every one of those could be sort of a soundbite to get a conversation going about how have the humanities been affected by this and how have they responded. And I don't know, I'm not a specialist in economics at all. I gave Thomas Piketty's book a good shot. I read most of it, Capital. And if anything, that book taught me that the welfare state that I grew up in and took for granted is the anomaly, is not the norm and has not been historically the norm. So that was useful. I also found out he relied a lot on Jane Austen to indicate, on the humanities, on a novelist, to indicate what value, particularly the difference between money and landed property, he illustrates that through novels. Balzac, of course, a great sociological resource as well, and Austen figure prominently. Anyway, instead of talking about economics, I've just called it problems related to money. And basically, a neoliberal ethos and the inequality that follows from that, and you only have to listen. I was telling Jan earlier when I came in that I listened to the debate between Macron and Le Pen, and boy, the choice is horrific, actually. When you think of what the need for adequate funding and the reality of a post-welfare state is a huge issue for the humanities. Because in this context, economic growth has taken on an increasingly narrow definition. A definition which actually, when you think of it, has very little to do with overall improvement in living conditions. So economic growth gets often invoked, but if you actually look at what it has meant in terms of improvement of health, access to adequate healthcare, education, there's no direct connection. So the idea of profit and citizenship is also a tricky one. So we get the gap between financial gain for some, the so-called economic growth, individual profit, and the implementation of improvements in education, health, and arts for all. And it really gets to me, because of course after Trump got elected, I immediately paid up for the online version of The Guardian as well, you know, in addition to already getting the little paper copy, you know. And I'm getting very annoyed by articles that sort of have these headlines about well-being that talk about people who live in streets with trees are healthier and have a better lifestyle. And I'm thinking, who the F can live in a street with trees? Look at it. When you look at neighborhoods in Europe who actually lives in streets with trees, those people also have usually access already to far better education, far better healthcare. So there are all these kind of little statements that gets thrown out. Playing music does wonders for your child. It does. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But it costs money. It costs money in New Zealand if you want your child to really learn about music. It's not happening in school. I know. I'm a mother whose son, you know, studies music. So there are all these things that are related to appreciation and embeddedness in the humanities, which have to do with hard cash, actually, with access to funds. The other one, in a society that's obsessed with narrow economic growth, is the obsession with vocational education. For those of you with children or grandchildren, people come home, and students come home, and now they say, I'm really worried about what I'm going to do, but what job I'm going to have. And I sort of, at first go, honey, why would you be worried about that? And then I'm thinking, why would he not be worried about that? Because times again have changed, and a lot of that sort of ferreting around, finding yourself, that's gone. You know, supporting yourself, and surviving, you know, buying a house in Wellington, good luck. So there are all these factors where what can sound Philistine to the kind of tax-funded, educated people like me about how can you worry about that are very, very real worries for young people. So that the duty, I think, of the humanities to articulate that what we learn through the humanities has a vocational dimension, even if it's not a one-on-one dimension, even if it is not a bean-counting NCEA, if you do this, you will do this job. Because if anything, the fact that that job will still be there in 10 years is minimal. Work environment changes hugely. You need an increased adaptability, flexibility, and an articulate voice to apply, to create, to forge other professional opportunities. Okay. Another problem, that's really problems related to money, problems related to size, the emphasis on quantity and problematic taxonomies. For those of us who are doing research in the humanities, we always encounter grids, forms we have to fill out, which are based on a very different taxonomy, which emphasize quantity over quality, which don't really take on board the story. Very important, storytelling, in the broadest sense of the word, the story of why something matters. Not just, I will argue this and my outcomes will be 1, 2, 3, but also the significance of this meaning-making exercise. So, we deal with performance-based research funding and other assessment, the idea of publish and perish, outputs, all of that. So, checklists are the norm. Grant applications, word limits. There's an anecdote in Nussbaum's book where somebody didn't quite meet the word limit, so they threw in the word empirical 6 more times. That did the trick. There's a cynicism attached to that kind of form filling, which unfortunately is a reality in a lot of the situations we deal with. I wish that was not the case. At the same time, I'm a complete stickler as well as a humanities person for precision, for being articulate, concise, persuasive. So sometimes when I talk with good friends and scientists in the sciences, people who are neuroscientists, climatologists, lovely people that I have great conversations with, some of them think that I sort of spout poetry all the time or something. But no, not really. So that dialogue also indicates that we need to bridge a kind of understanding about, between quantity and quality, what substance really is, informed both by figures and by thinking. So unfortunately, our social media, our larger online worlds emphasize transient brevity, to be seen to do something, to gesture to something rather than offer substance. So narrow assessments geared toward narrow vocations is problematic. And I'm not using all these words that I should be using as well. Thinking creatively, imaginatively is absolutely crucial. So we have money, quantity, and this has to do with what actually all relates at some level to empathy and the ability to imagine somebody else's predicament or situation. Problems related to identity, interaction, and media. Frankly, I think that finding yourself is overrated. I think that being kind and appreciative of other people, deserves a bit more limelight again as well. So again, their interaction, speed over substance, the kind of ingrained narcissism in the forms of social media, the selfies, the very, very tricky to gain meaningful relationships and talk about the humanities like that too. So an online life, what does that mean for citizenship, for our accountability as citizens? Kind of sort of those trigger responses. We're like back in the kind of the bad old days of the Roman Empire, thumbs down, thumbs up, like, don't like, and onward it goes, just moving on. So that lack of context also for accountability, trolling, bullying online, the idea of opinion, again, over significance and considered response. A lot of you, I'm sure, get barrages of email, get email all the time. I find if I don't answer an email within 2 hours, I will probably get a follow-up email that says, didn't you get my email? So any response, a fast, unconsidered response is often considered better than a thoughtful, reflective response. Tricky. Again, can the humanities flourish in that kind of, speed? Maybe it's speed and identity there, the kind of vast, propulsion into new areas all the time. Also that sort of idea of insurance models of interaction, networking all the time. Can you put that in writing? Giving somebody a compliment. Is it tit for tat? How can we actually go beyond that or above it? Okay, problems related to education. Again, very broad, just a few thoughts I had really. The vocational anxiety of our young people. We need to be mindful of that, I think, a very justified fear of poverty. The safety nets aren't there the way they were there for me. And I need to develop the empathy to realize what that really means. Increasingly, of course, through children, homework, NCEA taxonomies, checklists that also suck in teachers who really have to produce these outputs, churn out these units all the time. Very interesting reading if you go to the website and see what learning is defined as. Emphasis on assessment versus emphasis on learning, the output, what do I get if I do this? And in that context, it's very difficult to articulate in a way also a framework to defend and protect the humanities, but I do think we need to do that all the same. So I keep arguing for contact with students, face-to-face contact, rather than just flexible online learning, which we are definitely pushed towards. The idea of actually having to look at somebody when you tell them that you don't agree with something, and find a way of saying that without hurting, without being dismissive. It takes courage. It also takes, in a way, learning. It's a process. It's something you learn. And then, of course, there's also the whole new library, you know. If you're used to an old library, which was like a building that had books in it that you took from shelves, well, of course, that's gone. And sources, the idea of what do you read about what, how do we find about things, has changed hugely. Big challenge also for the humanities to take responsibility for how our repositories of knowledge are managed and articulated. So, what are some of our challenges then? Very quickly, articulating what literacy is, clarifying the very real economic significance of it, integrate literacy in teaching all the time, analysing for significance, slow reading, slow writing, reflecting on information, and interactive, respectful, safe, critical debate. So, you know, the accountability which we have towards our funding kind of instances, but also the lobbying we need to do to make the flourishing of the humanities possible. And that means, and I'm very pleased we've got somebody from Zealandia here. One of the things I love about Zealandia is that it works with a 500-year or plus time frame. The need for a time frame beyond individual human lifespan, the long now. You know, I think it's a very important one, that it's not just for one generation. Empathy and sympathy, and also meaning, and the understanding that perspectives and pluralism does not necessarily mean incoherence. That if it's not painting by numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or unnecessary. Non-linear problem-solving, appreciation of complexity. Again, I'm sure that Carwyn will enlighten us to some extent about it as well. The idea of the importance of stories and very different contexts and sources of those stories. Beyond quantification, bringing reflection to all intellectual inquiry, and also that idea of. If the humanities argues it's about what makes people happy, the arts, you know, beautiful literature, beautiful art, we need to think about what happiness is, and that it's not just disposable pleasure. You know, again, that fast, the idea of a kind of contentment and happiness as different things. So we've got a bit more, you know, points that I've just tried to come up with. I've already repeated most of them, so I will wind up. What some of my friends said, I asked some of my friends, you know, what do the humanities, if you had to take one thing, what would it be? And somebody, a vet actually, she said right away for us to question ourselves. Then a grad school friend who's now a Shakespeare professor in Finland said that some subject may get us to the moon, it's the humanities which help us understand why we want to go there. And we can't necessarily know what the jobs will be 10 years from now, but it's the humanities that prepare us to be creative, critical thinking required to negotiate and respond to a rapidly changing environment. And that idea is very portable skill of a kind of resilience you bring. And then something I've been thinking about a lot for my own courses that I feel I will have to integrate much more clearly and specifically in the next couple of years is actually reflection on the humanities as part of courses about literature. So for instance, you teach, you know, Romanticism as I do, but also, you know, how does that relate to the humanities now? You know, how does the situation in Calais, on the shores of Calais, in a way respond to 1802, Wordsworth's Calais, post-French Revolution. You know, parallels that could be very useful. And of course also the humanities teach us that joy and wisdom feed each other. And I'll leave it here to make sure I'm not taking up more time. Thank you very much.
Heidi, thank you. That was fascinating. Lots and lots of food for thought. In particular, I hadn't thought about the way in which all of those things that we kind of kid ourselves we can have that are nice and easy and accessible are actually economic transactions often, the music and the art and the gardening and all of, you know, and the nice food. I mean, they're all those aspects of creativity. thank you very much, and congratulations on a wonderful, wonderful presentation. It falls to me now to introduce Dr. Carwyn Jones to you. Dr. Jones is going to introduce his new book, his new 2016 book, New Treaty, New Tradition, Reconciling New Zealand and Māori Law. And Carwyn's tribal affiliations are to Ngāti Kahungunu and Te Aitanga e Māhaki. And welcome, Carwyn. And look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Success. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou e hui nei tēnei pō. Kia ora koutou. So, thanks for the invitation to speak with you tonight, and thanks for coming out on a Friday to talk about these issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are covered in my book, New Treaty, New Tradition, which focuses on the treaty settlement process, and particularly the place of Māori law, Māori legal traditions in that process. And the aspect that I thought might be most useful to focus on in this context is to think about what reconciliation means and what that looks like in the context of thinking about Indigenous peoples and the state, and how we might all participate in a kind of national process of reconciliation. So the first thing I thought I might do then was to just give you a little bit of a rundown on what treaty settlements are like, just to give you some context about what this process that many iwi are engaged in, or many have completed. So we have at the basis of all treaty settlements claims about breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi which have led to some prejudice or some harm. Now, sometimes those claims go through a Waitangi tribunal process, which is a commission of inquiry where there's evidence put by the claimant groups, contested by the Crown. Large amounts of historical evidence are commissioned through this process usually, and the tribunal will make findings and recommendations about those claims. Now, not all claims will go through that that tribunal process. Some claimant groups will instead take those issues and go into direct negotiations with the Crown to find some settlement package. Now, even those claims that go through the Waitangi Tribunal process, usually, since the Office of Treaty Settlements was set up in the mid-1990s, usually they will also end up going through this negotiated process to get a settlement package. So when people hear about settlements and an amount of money that an iwi might get as part of their settlement process, that's something that's been negotiated with officials from the Crown, from the Office of Treaty Settlements, which is part of the Ministry of Justice. Now, both the Waitangi Tribunal process and the settlement process at the end of that are both part of this reconciliation program. One of the things that the Waitangi Tribunal process does is that it allows an opportunity for that foundation of research to be done and for a community to have their stories heard and acknowledged, and to put those sort of directly to the Crown and to have them acknowledged by an independent body like the Waitangi Tribunal. Now, that's a kind of important therapeutic part of the process, I think, and it can be important for those communities going through this process to do that together, to hear those stories told as a community. And they can also be really important for non-Māori communities as well. So, for example, with the Ngai Tahu claims process, that was something which was actually really well covered by the press at the time. There was someone down at the hearings each day reporting on what was being heard, and as a consequence, largely the Christchurch community, but others more widely in the South Island in particular, were getting quite a good sense of the history of interactions with Ngai Tahu in their home, in their areas, and understanding that history, I think, is an important part for setting those relationships on the right foundation. And I'll come to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But just to get back to the sort of basic framework of the treaty settlements that result in the end, people often hear about this kind of money figure, the headline figure of money, and that is part of it. You'll see there are sort of three components here that really make up all treaty settlements, and the commercial redress is part of it. So that's a financial amount that's designed to provide some acknowledgement of harm or injury that's occurred. The amount of money itself is often quite a small percentage of the value of land that was lost, and it's often in the region of 2 or 3% of the value of land that was lost. So it really is just an acknowledgement rather than any kind of full compensation. Now, alongside the commercial redress are two other important parts of the settlement package. And the first is what's known as the historical account. And so with any settlement, there is an agreed, negotiated historical account, and that's agreed between the Crown and between the settling group as what represents a reflection of the interactions between the Crown and that group over time, or since 1840 in particular. And that historical account then provides the basis for acknowledgements of treaty breaches that have occurred, and then for Crown apologies for those breaches. And again, those are an important part of the reconciliation process. They're important from perspective of both the settling group and the Crown. In a sense, these acknowledgements and apology is what the Crown is getting out of these treaty settlements, because what it's wanting to do is saying we are taking responsibility for those breaches that have occurred, we're apologising for them, and as a consequence we're now setting off with a clean slate almost, if you will. So that's a really important part for the Crown, but it's also, as you can imagine, really important for the settling group to have that acknowledgement from the Crown and that apology for injury that has occurred as a result of treaty breaches. And sometimes these treaty breaches have resulted in not only loss of land, which has economic consequences, but oftentimes has resulted in major disruptions in communities. But often these are breaches for actual physical harm that was done to people as well. So if people have been improperly arrested or detained, this is in the 19th century in particular, or sometimes people summarily executed even. So these breaches do contain serious things such as loss of life. And as I say, an important part of the reconciliation process is the acknowledgement that the Crown is taking responsibility for those. And the other component of the treaty settlement packages is cultural redress. So this is often compared to the commercial redress. The cultural redress is not intended to have any commercial element to it, and these are often things such as joint management or governance arrangements over particular sites of cultural or historical significance. They are partnership agreements entered into with various government agencies. Often local government plays a big role here as well. And they can include things like place name changes too, and that's often to officially recognise a Māori name for a place, sometimes to correct an incorrect spelling of a Māori place name, those kinds of things too. And there's a whole lot of things which can be covered by that cultural redress package. So ultimately then, when we're thinking about treaty settlements, we're not just thinking about some commercial money and land, but there's a whole range of things that go alongside that are intended to support this sort of reconciliation process. And again, just coming back to the acknowledgements and apology, as I mentioned, those are really important, but they're really only important if they are followed up with some substantive action. Otherwise they do become empty words. So the kind of cultural redress in particular, and the commercial or financial part of the package really gives some substance to those apologies. Okay. Now, alongside reconciliation, the other kind of component, or the sort of key objective really of the treaty settlement process, is one of increased self-determination. And to my mind, you can't really split those two ideas, separate them, because and it comes back to the idea of that the apology by itself would be an empty statement, and it needs some substance to it, and that substance is about providing for increased self-determination. And there are just a number of points that I think are useful to think about in terms of what this new relationship might mean that is coming out of treaty settlements, what reconciliation in this context might mean. One of the people who writes about the relationships between Indigenous peoples and states is a Canadian political philosopher, James Tully, and I really like his work in this area. And he says you can think about relationships between Indigenous peoples and states as being either treaty relationships or colonial relationships. Now, importantly, these are kind of theoretical models of relationships. So a treaty relationship is one where there is the parties are engaging with mutual respect and mutual recognition of each other's ways of operating, of each other's systems of organising and government and those kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily actually mean that there is an actual treaty. And neither does it mean that every relationship which is based on a treaty is an ideal one. It is based on good faith and mutual recognition and those kinds of things. But he says it's useful to think about these two different types of relationships. One where you can imagine a treaty type relationship, and the other, he says, which is a colonial relationship, which is a relationship where one side is imposing their view of the world, their way of operating on the other. And of course, he says the treaty relationships are the ones that we should be aiming for. And to that extent, he says we should be thinking about those ideas of mutual recognition and respect. So what do those mean in terms of moving through a reconciliation process, moving from a colonial relationship to a treaty relationship? What might that mean. And one of the things he talks about in terms of mutual recognition and respect is the idea that that entails a mutual recognition of each other as peoples who have autonomy and authority in their own space and have ways of organising, have a worldview, have systems of laws and government which also are to be respected and engaged with, not simply oppressed or have that kind of colonial relationship put over the top of them. And Tully's also very big on this idea of as part of this, the need for intercultural negotiation. So the idea that there's discussions which take place which might move us towards reconciliation can't simply just be grounded in one side of the conversation, that they need to engage across those two different worldviews or different cultures in order to find that middle ground and to find those processes that are going to move us forward and move us more into that kind of ideal treaty relationship. The other person that I quite like who writes about reconciliation in the context of Indigenous peoples is a Lakota woman, Waziatuan, and she talks about the kind of stages that would be necessary for a genuine reconciliation process. And she says, so the first stage is to go through a process of truth-telling. And so in some senses we might think of our Waitangi tribunal process as being about engaging in a process of truth-telling. And then she says there ought to be a process of reparation that takes place for historical wrongs that have been done in the past. And then she says there ought to be a process of what she describes as taking down the fort. And so she says it's not simply enough to go through truth-telling and the reparation if we're then just going to go back to a cycle of using the same institutions which have caused trouble, going back to a kind of colonial relationship again. And so she says actually we need to dismantle the apparatus which has caused those problems in the first place, and then the final stage in that is to think about how to construct systems which are kind of based on the sorts of ideas that Tully talks about, which are based on mutual respect, mutual recognition and intercultural negotiation. So those are sort of some fundamental ideas that I think are important in terms of thinking about reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and states. And I think they're applicable to the New Zealand context as much as the Canadian or North American context more broadly that Tully and Waziatuan are writing in. The last thing I want to touch on is just if we're thinking about intercultural negotiation, if we're thinking about mutual recognition and respect of these different worldviews and different sets of values, I just wanted to very quickly point to some of the values that I think are central to our Māori worldview. And so these are whanaungatanga, which is essentially the centrality of relationships in the Māori world. So if we think about the Māori worldview, it's one in which everything is interconnected, not only people but the natural world as well, and all relationships are really understood through the lens of these literal kin relationships. And that has an important effect on how you define your rights and obligations in particular contexts. There's also the concept of mana, which is really important in terms of the exercise of public authority, and importantly, one of the things I think people are not often aware about it in terms of the way that mana operates is that because your mana is determined by your own, in part, by your own actions, and because in Māori society traditionally the way that a leader would get people to follow them was to persuade rather than command. It kind of meant you had to kind of continually demonstrate your leadership abilities. You had to continually demonstrate you had the mana to be able to convince people of your perspective and your point of view. And so the Māori leaders, it's often said, had quite a low level of executive authority, but a high level of accountability in that context. Tapu Noa, reflecting that all things in the Māori world have a spiritual dimension, so and Tapu Noa are really complementary opposites. So one reflecting those things which are set apart because they need to be managed carefully because of their spiritual significance. Noa being the kind of complementary opposite to that, which is centrally important in managing things which are highly tapu, which need to be managed carefully or by a particular process. Utu is a concept sometimes translated as being about revenge, but of course is actually more about balance and reciprocity. And so just as much as you need to take action to gain redress for a harm that's been done to you, so you have obligations to take action for good that has been done to you as well. And this is a kind of centrally important idea in terms of that striving for a maintenance of balance being a key part of Māori society. And then the final concept that I have up there is manaakitanga, which is very much about nurturing, caring for others. And again, this is a really important driving force in Māori society. And I've had discussions with some people who think that, particularly in the context of talking about Māori law, that manaakitanga doesn't really sit as a legal concept because they think it's a kind of nice idea about looking after people. But I actually think it is a legal concept because that it is an enforceable legal duty and an obligation, and it has serious consequences if those obligations are not fulfilled. So I see it very much as part of a kind of Māori legal framework, if you like. So those are sort of some of the key Māori values that I would see being part of thinking about the sort of intercultural negotiation, being part of the things that we need to take into account in terms of mutual recognition and respect and how the Māori world operates, that needs to feed into and feed through this process of reconciliation, which, as I say, is partly being undertaken through these treaty settlement processes. And so just the last thing that I wanted to question that I wanted to leave you with really is to think about, so I've been talking about reconciliation between Māori and the state, but of course this is a national program of reconciliation, and it is going to require all of us to be engaged in that process to some extent. So the question that I'd like to leave you with is to think about what the role you think you can play in this process of reconciliation. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Carwyn. That was very thought-provoking, inspiring, and so I'm guessing there's a conversation that could go on for a very long time. But I'm going to call you to order and introduce Dr. Danielle Shanahan. Danielle works at Zealandia, and she's been back in Wellington. She's a local person, been overseas in Australia for a long time studying, and she's come back not only to be the head of research at Zealandia, but also with a fascinating research base that informs why she can be so passionate about Zealandia. So I'll hand over to Danielle to tell you all about that.
Lovely. Now, traditionally I'm not much of a podium speaker. I tend to do a lot of arm waving. Hopefully that doesn't impact on the quality of my presentation this evening. But Yeah, so I'm a manager of conservation, research, learning and experience up at Zealandia. I'm from Wainuiomata originally, but as Jan mentioned, I've been away for roughly 20 years or so, so it's a long time, but it's quite wonderful being back in Wellington. It's such an amazing collaborative environment, and people are totally into nature here, which is really neat. So yeah, I'm going to give you a little bit of hopefully we'll finish in a bit of a positive note. I'm going to give you a bit of a dance through the scene, which is the connection between people, nature and health. And we'll look at some solutions to creating more space and time for nature in your life towards the end of the presentation. But nature really, I guess, is our lifeblood. For me, it's an important part of my spirituality. But speaking from a more economic sense, it gives us our fresh water, filters water, takes the pollutants out, provides a base for our livelihoods. So our soils are fundamental to our economy, fundamental to our dairy industry, to all those sorts of farming practices that we've got going on in New Zealand. So it really is a fundamental part of the New Zealand economy. And in fact, any economy in the world is ultimately based usually on some sort of natural resource at its core. My particular interests are really around health and wellbeing. So I'm an ecologist by training, so my PhD's in ecology, but my view on the sciences is more of a holistic view. So I feel passionately that the different sciences are connected. Sciences are connected to humanities, and all of these things work together to make the world a better place. So the connection between people, nature and health has really been a topic of sort of dedicated scientific study for a very long time. We see it in early Greek writings, it comes right throughout human history. But in modern times, we see one of the earliest studies in about 1979. Now this study, what it did was it looked at people recovering from gallbladder surgery in hospital. It did a lovely little randomised study. It put a bunch of people in a room with a view of trees out the window, a bunch of people with a view of a brick wall out the window. The people with a view of trees actually got out of hospital a day or two quicker. So it was the first indication that not only is this a nice to have, but in fact it can be fundamental for our economy, because you imagine the cost of keeping people in hospital a day longer could be reduced. As simple as that. So since then, we've seen a bit more of a plethora of studies coming out, and we have a huge range of health and wellbeing benefits that are starting to develop in terms of evidence in the literature. So on one side of this little figure, we see declines in mental fatigue. So that means your cognitive function increases with experiences of nature. We see reductions in stress and blood pressure, and also see reductions in cardiovascular disease. In fact, to the point where you see lower levels of mortality from cardiovascular disease in neighbourhoods that are greener. So that's quite a marked finding. That was one of a pretty pioneering study. Now, on the other hand, we see a lot of improvements. Like, as I mentioned, we see improvements in our cognitive function, so we can think better in a more relaxed fashion. Improves our mental health, so we see lower rates of depression and anxiety. And also our social wellbeing. So getting out into our local neighbourhood green space makes us connect with our neighbours. We see who's around. We see the sort of lay of the land, if you will. Of course, the other benefit of that is physical activity, which I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but you can see there's a huge range of ways that we gain benefits from our natural environment. Now, I know that probably a lot of this is quite intuitive to you, so of course nature is really good for our health and well-being. But it's quite interesting that we're seeing statistics like this. This is from my own research, which shows that about 60% of people really, if ever, get out into green space. That's going for a walk, going for a dedicated walk in a green space. Now this is research from Brisbane, but I've replicated it in the UK and we see almost the same statistics. So this is starting to come up quite frequently. Of course, there's a range of reasons for this. We've got a long commute often, we've got a huge range of activities, life's so busy. Kids need to go from one activity to another, extracurricular things going all over the place. But it suggests that something's changing in our lives. It means nature isn't quite having the place that we might like it to. Another slightly more scary statistic is this one, which is in New Zealand, children spending on average 50 hours in front of screens per week, which is a phenomenal amount. That's more time than I spend at work. So this is quite an incredible statement. As Helen mentioned earlier, of course having a tree in your neighbourhood costs money, but we're making trade-offs here. We're making real trade-offs. We might not be spending money on that tree or going to see that tree, but we're spending money somewhere else, and that's our investment in time and these other activities. Okay, it's leading to changes in other parts of our lives. Interesting. So this is a really interesting little story reported in The Guardian just up here. It's changes in the Oxford Junior Dictionary. So, our ABCs, we have words that we learn our ABCs with. We used to learn A is for acorn, now we learn, I believe, A is for Apple computer. Slightly different natural thing. And B is for buttercup. I think there it highlights B is actually for broadband. So this change really created a bit of an outcry across the UK at the time, but we're seeing these sorts of changes in our priorities infiltrating every aspect of our life. Now, another aspect that's I find quite intriguing is this change in the way we design our suburbs. So on the left-hand side is a suburb that was designed in the early 1900s. This is an Auckland suburb. You can see there that the house footprints are pretty small. They're about 30% of the lot that they sit on. Fast forward to the year 2000, the suburb was developed. You can see the house covers the majority of the block, leaving a little space for the swimming pool or the trampoline, but not a lot of space for that tree that we might like to have climbed when we were a kid. So this is an interesting shift. It seems like nature is becoming a luxury that we're not necessarily making the most of. Now, I think none of you will be surprised to know that actually these trends also follow socio-economic patterns. So the suburb on the left, the average house price of that one was about $1.5 million. On the right-hand side, that suburb, the average price was around, house and land package, $600,000. So this housing on the right is affordable, this is what people are choosing, and this is what's accessible. So here again, nature is a luxury. Those big trees are a luxury. So, now, that's me for doom and gloom. I'm going to move forward now, looking ahead. I'm really interested as a researcher and from a personal level in how we make nature experiences more accessible. How do we make them more accessible and more preferred? How do we make them part of people's lives? Now, just a little exercise for you. I've started breaking nature exposure down. This is becoming a bit reductionist, I know, but it helps me think about nature, it helps me quantify it, which is a little bit scary in some respects, but sometimes we're forced to do these things. But thinking about exposure to nature like you would physical activity. So I'd like a show of hands. Who here manages to get out into some sort of green space once a month? Okay, so that's most of you. Once a week, keep your hand up. Cool, okay, once a day? Great, okay. Now for duration, hands up if you manage to get out for 30 minutes or more a week. And that's most of you. A day? Okay, we're doing pretty well. Okay, finally for intensity, hands up if you manage to get to a place like Zealandia or the bush somewhere. Yeah, once a week? Yep, cool. Right, once a day. Anyone? Cool, so we start to see that we can actually look at how we might enhance our exposure to nature across these different dimensions. Interestingly, my research is showing that there are thresholds in these things. So for example, in terms of frequency, getting out, making that dedicated trip about once a week is actually enough to have a major effect on our health, particularly in terms of our levels of depression and our levels of high blood pressure in society. In terms of duration, getting out for 30 minutes at a time is much better than just 10 minutes. So that is enough to really significantly impact on the chances of depression and high blood pressure as well, and a whole range of other outcomes. These aren't tiny effects either. What we're looking at is effects that are equivalent to, for example, reducing obesity in society in terms of the impact on health and wellbeing. So they're not marginal changes that we could actually really enhance population health in this way. So that's some of the way that my research is going, is starting to think about nature and those different elements and how they affect our health and wellbeing. Okay, so just to finish off, I just wanted to talk through a few different ways that we can think about to actually enhance our exposure to nature. I saw this really great article come out recently. It went through, the Couch Potatoes Guide to Saving the World. And it talked about sustainability and things that you can do from your couch. So thinking about that in terms of nature exposure, there are a couple of little things you can do around your house that have marked and scientifically proven benefits to your health and wellbeing. Put up a pot plant and a picture, just something as simple as having a picture of nature on the screen on your computer. It's just enough to start having an effect on your health and wellbeing. As manager of Zealandia though, that's not quite enough for me. I'd like to push it a little further. But we can look at things like nature-based gardening. So this is a classic backyard in a lot of places. I'm doing house shopping at the moment, and this is incredibly prevalent and seems to be something that people want. But why not something a bit more like this? So every time you walk out your front door, you're getting that little dose of nature that can just enhance your health and wellbeing along the way. And look at the kind of biodiversity and habitat that you might provide in that environment. Look at maybe replanning your route to work, taking a slightly different turn through a greener street or through a park. Again, has a marked impact on your wellbeing. And finally, taking it to level 3, so this is really getting out there, trying to do some green exercise, like this lovely walking group. I think Pam might be in that picture somewhere at Zealandia. Finding a way to create some green exercise in your life. Green exercise compared to exercise, for example, in the gymnasium or on a treadmill, massive benefits across a range of different outcomes. And finally, taking it really the next level is some conservation volunteering. So coming to a place like Zealandia and getting stuck in and really just engaging with that environment. They all have some impact on your health and wellbeing. So just to highlight, I think it's a little bit scary sometimes to go, well, I have to add this whole other thing to my life. I have to create this whole other space in my life for something quite, which isn't easy to achieve. But there are little things that you can do that can just add value. So finally, just to end, I just wanted to make a little comment regarding those trends that we talked about earlier, particularly regarding the socioeconomic biases and access to nature, and how we might make that something part of everyone's life rather than just a select few. I'm particularly interested in a research front and how we create parks that aren't just appealing to your traditional European background. That's the mown lawn, maybe a little bit of a hedge or a few scattered trees. I'm really interested in how your background and how the way you grew up actually shapes your preferences for parks, particularly in urban landscapes, and how that and whether that those special designs that are tailored to you from wherever you're from might actually influence the way you get out and engage. An interesting example of this is I've been working with some researchers at Vic Uni in the landscape and architecture faculty, looking at whether creating a wellness walk focusing on Māori rāroa plants, so medicinal plants that have some benefit, whether creating that sort of environment might actually encourage people from a different demographic to get out and engage with that space. So there's different ways of thinking about this, different ways of thinking about it from a council perspective and a neighbourhood perspective. From Zealandia's point of view, I have an education team at my disposal. They're pretty incredible. They engage around 10,000 kids per year. But one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we have a particular focus on Wainuiomata. So bringing kids from Wainuiomata, we've managed to get funding that pays for their bus fares and brings them out to Zealandia for a special education experience. We follow that up with education experience in their own backyard. So teaching them how to create a special little sanctuary in their special places, in their backyard, in their schools. So making that something that perhaps they prefer, perhaps they learn is achievable and can be done in their own places. So I'm going to leave it like that, but we'll highlight that these things do take time, and as Helen highlighted, we have a 500-year vision, so we aren't looking in the short term. I think all of these things, bringing nature back into our lives, will take time and will take gradual shifts. We shouldn't worry about everything and panic about everything right now, because there is hope, I think. So.
Hey, so I'm really impressed with the idea of time, intensity and duration as a measure of how much time I get in the outdoors.
I would just like to confess, it's quite appropriate to confess in here, isn't it, seeing it's a church? I'd like to confess that was much more interesting than the screens I usually watch on a Friday night. So thank you very much to our three speakers. That was a real feast of flourishing. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.